Hey, I'm Jake from Semisonic, and I'm giving a shout out to all my fellow Darkwood Brew fans. Hello from chilly New York.
Our minds and our hearts are both sacred. Faith and science, doubt and belief serve the pursuit of truth. Join us for Evolving Universe, Evolving Faith, a Darkwood Brew series produced in collaboration with the Adler Planetarium in Chicago and the Clergy Letter Project. We're exploring how current scientific theories on creation and the evolution of the universe, quantum theory, and the human body itself reawaken our spiritual imagination more robustly than any time since the Enlightenment. Please join us on this exciting journey.
Hi, welcome to Darkwood Brew, where it's a spiritual gathering where Christians gather on the internet and converge, really, to explore ancient Christian mystical practice using modern interactive web technology, world-class jazz, arts, biblical scholarship, and, well, you never know what's going to happen, including hosts giving out blustery snow right now. So if you've ever wondered if the power of your prayers do anything, if prayer actually does something for you, you know, I really can't comment on that, but I can comment on the power of my prayer because I'm probably the only one in a million people who live in and around Omaha who's actually praying for snow. Check it out. So if you would like me to pray for the weather system in your area, I invite you to push the donate button on the Darkwood Brew website and put your hand on the television with me, and we'll pray for your weather. Now, if you're just joining us for the first time, you've joined us for part 5 of our 7-part series, Evolving Universe, Evolving Faith, exploring the relationship between faith and science. Last week, a member of my congregation came up to me after worship and confided that she had a hard time with the concept of evolution, that we evolved out of primordial protoplasm and became human. She said, I don't feel like we're accidents. I feel like God intended for us to be here. What do you think? Are we simply cosmic accidents, or are those genes that encode our DNA designer genes? Behind that question there are other questions that reside even closer to our hearts, like, is there meaning and significance in life beyond what I ascribe to it? Is there a God who is consciously aware of me? Or is there perhaps no God at all? Well, helping us explore these questions tonight is Harvard astrophysicist Owen Gingerich. Owen Gingerich has written a fascinating book called God's Universe, in which Gingerich argues that there is evidence of intelligence that designs the universe, but argues against intelligent design with a capital I, capital D. What's the difference between affirming intelligent design and an intelligent designer? And what is the evidence that suggests that there is an intelligence behind the universe? Well, that's what we'll be exploring tonight at Darkwood Brew. But before we go any further, let's take a look at what's happened in the past in our series.
Brother Moses wasn't born to settle down. Brother Moses wasn't born to settle down, settle down. He was born to rise.
As we explore more and more and we learn more and more in science, we see that far from taking away the mystery, we deepen the mystery.
I think you start out with this idea of what it's going to be like, and then when you do finally look at the Earth for the first time, you're overwhelmed by how much more beautiful it really is when you see it for real.
To the degree that each of us incarnates that seed of divinity, that seed of commitment to living in integrity and being of service to the future and to the well-being of the larger body of life, we actually participate in the second coming of Christ.
Maybe we're just lucky and blessed to bear witness to the flashing of this meteor, the tail of this comet. Maybe we're cursed, maybe we're fortunate. Maybe we just go on a milky white way. Maybe we get to stay.
Humanity is really just a blip. We're latecomers on the scene. We haven't been here very long. We're enmeshed in all of these interconnections. And so I think this is really one of those places where faith and science there's conflict.
The expansion of scientific knowledge for you made God smaller?
Absolutely not. It makes the whole thing more awesome. And I would personally welcome the discovery of, cosmic brothers and sisters out there, so to speak. And I wouldn't want to place any assumptions on how God may relate to them.
You have anointed me and given me strength. My eyes can see, my ears can hear. I'll be strong like the trees of Lebanon and cherish in the parts of the Lord. It is good to give thanks to the Lord. It is good to give praise to the Lord Most High.
So your prayers for snow have been answered.
Hey, it's like I say, push the donate button, put the hand on the screen, and we'll start praying.
I'm just feeling the power. Aren't you guys feeling the power tonight? We had a question on our social media this week. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. What else does it bend toward, moral or otherwise? We have several different answers. One-word answers from Kathy, Matt, Renee, and Jerry. Mercy, equality, compassion, constant evolution, and change. Those are all really great answers that talk about the wholeness, kind of thing. That if we're moving from justice toward compassion, mercy, equality, that's all good stuff.
Yeah, I'm reminded about that constant evolution and change. The ancients actually, oftentimes in our day, we kind of want the world to stop, and we think, there's so much change. We wish we could just stay still, and we could only live in simpler times when things didn't change. But the ancients really didn't have any concept that things didn't change. They were very much part of an evolving and changing world. I'm reminded just simply they would look at the stars and notice, unlike us, they would notice that the stars would actually cross, the heavens in front of them. And for them, charting the stars was really the equivalent of tracking the changing will of the divine. They were looking at it astrologically, and so for them, the kind of the universal constant, was change. I was trying to pull up my there's a little program on Astracantus in my iPhone that actually you can hear the sounds of the stars that are passing directly over the studio here at Darkwood Brew. If I can turn it on here. Give you a chance to just hear it. A tone has been assigned to every single star. Every single star has received a tone depending on its level of brightness, and the GPS in the phone actually locates where we are and then draws an imaginary meridian above, and then it's going to play the tones for the stars. Okay. It really is. Uh-oh. Oh, hear all that,
the time
all of that
change.
preparation.
It's affected
the time change. Daylight savings time happened today, and it's just not talking to me. Oh well, never mind. Rewind.
Well, it is really cool when it does work.
It is cool.
Technology is really great when it works.
Let me show you my iPhone cover, Darkwood Brew iPhone cover.
Yeah, that's very cool too. Well, another answer we got was from Susan Hamilton, who gives us a whole different aspect, I think, on this idea of arc. She says, an arc is only part of the wave of energies which make up our universe. Long or short, the waves repeat themselves. However, if one turns a wave on its end and look down at it, one sees a spiral that is the evolutionary journey of humanity and each lifetime. There's
our bass player has Astracantus on his phone too, Steve Gomez.
Yay.
There we go.
That's why he won the award.
He's got not just tones, he's got strings attached to it. So every time you hear a string being played, that's a star passing immediately overhead. The music of the heavens. A lot of change going on up there. Thanks, Steve.
And when you listen to that, imagine the arc, looking down on the arc and seeing a spiral and a whole lifetime's journey being
it's very poetic.
Traveled.
Yeah.
It's very poetic. I love that answer. Cody Stauffer answered, infinity. Why does it have to bend to an end? There was some discussion on Facebook about whether or not an arc was part of a whole circle that was more of an infinitesimal process that would just keep going and going and going. And so that idea that does it lean in towards something or does it process into things or whatever is the image that came to mind through that. So that was a fun discussion.
Yeah. Well, speaking of coming to an end, we have 2 more episodes in this series before it comes to an end. We will not be broadcasting on Easter Sunday. So actually, no, we will. We'll be broadcasting a previously recorded episode.
Yes.
So we hope you'll join us on Easter, but we will not be streaming live, but we will be having the chat feature operating. Next week, we'll be joined by Gail Wallachak, who is, she's just a brainiac. She is the Associate Director of the Zygon Center for Faith and Science in Chicago, but she's also a professor of oncology and radiology, as well as cellular and molecular science at Northwestern University. fascinating
Yes.
person. So she'll be with us next week, and then we'll finish up with one more week and then go to Easter. After Easter, we'll be starting a brand new series, and this one is based on faith and the environment, called On Earth as It Is in Heaven. And that's going to be a great one. We're going to be tracing every one of the 7 days of creation in Genesis, using that as simply a jumping off point to exploring, turning our heavens from our view from the heavens to the earth and exploring that. Alongside that series, we're going to be encouraging folks to check out this book, The Book of Creation by John Philip Newell, who is a worldwide expert in Celtic Christianity, a form of Christianity that has always, since ancient times, been vitally in touch with the earth and its ecosystems, and integrated with it seamlessly within Christian theology. So we'll invite you to pick up a copy of that book. You won't need it for the series, but it will enhance your experience of the series. And we'll be linking up with the National United Church of Christ, the denomination United Church of Christ. It just so happens by coincidence, and I don't mean like coincidence, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I mean like actual coincidence, that we were planning this series on faith and science, and they were planning a national kind of get out the activity on called Mission for One Earth, which is really a 50-day focus starting right after Easter on the environment. Mm-hmm. Their object is to plant 100,000 trees, to engage in about like 1 million hours of earth care, and write 100,000 letters that advocate on an environmental issue, or of a person's choice, to an elected official or to the local papers. So it's going to be a really fun time. We're going to be in conversation with the United Church of Christ during that series. So hope you'll join us.
It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, finally, we hope that you'll also consider, I'm not going to pray for the weather system, but if you will donate, that really does help. We really appreciate those donations that have come in this week, too. You're really inching us closer and closer to the goal to meet a $25,000 challenge grant that's been given generously to Darkwood Brew. Well, before we move on to Owen Gingerich, we simply want to invite you to remember this is not simply a webcast or a gathering in a coffee house, but also it's a spiritual gathering in which we seek insight from the Holy Spirit in our midst. And part of that, we want to step back into that bit of artistic engagement with creation and evolution that you saw at the front of this episode. We're going to check in on those imaginary creatures that fronted the episode. So let's step back into Big Bang, Big Boom, and then we'll be hearing from Owen Gingerich. Pretty fun reflection on the evolutionary progress. Well, Dr. Gingerich, it's great to have you on with us this evening. Are you coming to us from snowy Cambridge?
There's lots of white snow out here. We had a storm about a month ago, which still left its traces, and there were little spots of snow that we were just waiting to see how long it would take them to melt, and suddenly they were all covered again. We got nearly a foot of snow on Friday, and it's disappearing fast. You can practically hear it melting because of the trickle of the water coming out of the snowbanks.
Wow. Well, I have to make it clear I had nothing to do with the snow in Washington, D.C. No prayers were sent that way. So,
as you know, there was no snow in Washington.
Yeah, that's right. And in Cambridge, I mean, yeah. So it's all back east, right? So thank you for coming on this evening. I must say I've read your God's Universe a couple of times, and really have found it to be a very helpful kind of glimpse at the relationship between faith and science, and really exploring it with a lot of serious intent, using some pretty hard science. Is there evidence for God in the universe? One thing that I was intrigued by, though, is you make a distinction between intelligent design with a small I and a small d, or an intelligent designer, and intelligent design with a capital I and capital D. What's the difference between that kind of so-called intelligent design movement and you? What's intelligent design all about, the capital one?
I'd better start with the lowercase one.
Okay.
And that is that I believe that the universe has purpose and meaning, and in some fashion we're part of that. So I believe that we're looking at an incredibly ingenious creation, so many wonderful things in it that since I believe in a creator, I have to believe that the creator was intelligent and an intelligent designer. But the intelligent design movement with the capital I and the capital D is, to my mind, more like a political movement that is trying in some way to replace evolution, to say that evolution doesn't really explain things in many places, and that took not only God's hand as a planner, but as an active doer to get us across some of those gaps. I would say that evolution is still an unfinished business, and therefore we can't just use intelligent design coming in deus ex machina to go over those places.
So to be clear, then intelligent design, those folks will look at a gap in our knowledge about how one thing evolved into another, and say, well, oh, that's God. God supernaturally intervened and created that, like the rotor mechanism of the flagellum of a E. coli bacteria. I can't figure it out. It's too complex. Oh, it must be God that did it, right?
That's one of the kinds of arguments. And there are, of course, interesting problems still to be faced by the theoreticians working on evolution, but it's becoming clearer and clearer that there's something extraordinary about the structure of the genes, so that the late Ernst Mayr, who is considered the dean of the evolutionists, said that the eye had been invented maybe 36 times independently. And yet what we now know is that a fundamental gene for the eye goes way, way back in the evolutionary picture and is the same in all eyes. So there was something about getting ready for an eye to come out.
So are you suggesting that the fundamental gene that would actually produce an eye existed before there was even the existence of any kind of head to put the eye in?
Correct.
Wow.
It's amazing, but this is part of the new patterns of evolution. As you probably know, if we talk about our genome, that is to say, the DNA, these immense long coils, very tiny and thin so that it can be packed into each one of our cells, that only 2 or 3% of it codes for genes. And then there's the rest of this DNA structure. And I realized some years ago that, wait a minute, it's got to be doing something. Why? Because a kind of very ancient jellyfish has in its intermediate DNA, not the specific genes, sequences that exactly match the human DNA. Now, you can't go 500 million years transmitting this and not having it be good for something that we don't understand, because otherwise the mutation rate is such that it would have been destroyed over and over.
So part of what I hear you saying is that some of the odds that would create some of these advances in genetics are so great that we would have to have maybe an older Earth, even than 4.6 billion years, in order to actually have those things work their way out, that there are actually structures that are quite ancient that were that have sped things up?
If you're trying to make a gene just from scratch and put it together just randomly, the chances of getting a particular sequence is incredibly small. I mean, it would take way longer than the time of the universe to get it. So it has to be done in some other way. For example, it could be done by block at a time. You don't randomly put the whole thing together. You put it together by building one block against another in a very complex process, but you can build up these amino acids together to make the proteins. The proteins are like little machines. The shape of the protein is essential for its activity in the body. And there are huge numbers of these that you can make. I mean, there are enormous possibilities. Let's say we have 20 different amino acids, and you can put them together in various orders, and you want 50 of them together to make a complicated protein, a typical one, let's say. Now you want to make one each, so that in each position you have 20 choices of amino acids to build it up. The amount of mass is larger than the entire Milky Way galaxy.
Wow.
So obviously not all of those combinations have ever been worked out. But those that have created this fantastic display of life forms.
That's pretty amazing. The amount of mass. See, as I recall, the Milky Way galaxy is about 100,000 light years across, and about, I don't know, 10,000 light years thick, something like that.
Something like that. And so there's enough stars in it that every man, woman, and child on Earth can have 35.
All right. Oh, great. I was content with 30, but I'll take 35. That's amazing. Yeah. So what it sounds like what you're saying then is when you look at the Earth and its ecosystems, that first of all you affirm evolution. You are a true believer in that, and that's as an established fact, and that there are random processes. But it sounds like, and of course I've read your book too. I know that you argue that in a sense God creates, or there seems to be an intelligence that creates preferential pathways that kind of loaded the dice, so to speak. With some of these ancient amino acids, genes, and so forth that even seem to prefigure human creation, even though they're very, very old, and they therefore allow us to speed up the evolutionary process through the randomness happens, but it's been sped up.
There's a wonderful quotation that I didn't know when I was writing the God's Universe book, but it's pretty old. It's from one of the clergymen who was contemporary with Charles Darwin and one who accepted his evolutionary picture. And he said, we always thought that God was very wise, but we didn't understand that God was wise enough to make a creation that could create itself.
I love that. That's great. That does make a lot of sense. That in the sense that the intelligent design folks who kind of insert God into the gaps in our knowledge actually end up creating a very small God, because whenever our knowledge, we fill in that gap, it makes God smaller. And what you seem to be arguing for is a God who was actually intelligent enough to create a system that could work its way out and not need supernatural intervention, but it seems like it has a high degree of intentionality, but that's organically natural.
The whole idea of these nuclear particles suddenly popping into being, I was about to say that in one moment there was nothing, and a moment later suddenly you had the makings of huge numbers of hydrogen and helium atoms. But I can't quite say that, because to say at one moment implied that there was time. And time, of course, was invented at the moment of the Big Bang. Before that, we didn't have time. Perhaps there's God's time that is in some way different from our time, because in some sense, there had to be these laws of chemistry and physics that were going to be manifesting themselves, and we have to ask, where did they come from? And that's part of what I would say is the divine planning of it all.
Yeah. Well, we want to come back to that. Want to maybe pause here and come back to some of those the things you're seeing in the universe and creation of the universe that may suggest an intelligence behind that. We're going to transition for a moment and move into our Pneuma Divina passage. If you're just joining us for the first time, the centerpiece of Darkwood Brew is always the contemplation of a piece of scripture or poetry sometimes that is suggestive of our theme. And this evening we are looking at Psalm 111 in the Old Testament, and you'll hear Tracy Halverson read that once, and then you'll see the verses on the screen. And what we're asking you to do is simply get quiet and pay attention. And once that reading is done, ask yourself what sticks out in your mind. What do you still remember? If you're on chat this evening, we ask that you simply log in that verse that really sticks out most for you in our Pneuma poll. And in the coffee house, we'll be inviting you to write that down on your Pneuma sheets. And we'll, after our musical feature that will follow, we'll take a reading of what struck the most energy tonight, and invite Dr. Gingerich to comment on that. And one way or the other, we will comment on that verse that was chosen by you. So let's hear Psalm 111.
Praise the Lord. I will give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart, in the company of the upright, in the congregation. Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them. Full of honor and majesty is his work, and his righteousness endures forever. He has gained renown by his wonderful deeds. The Lord is gracious and merciful. He provides food for those who fear him. He is ever mindful of his covenant. He has shown his people the power of his works in giving them the heritage of the nations. The works of his hands are faithful and just. All his precepts are trustworthy. They are established forever and ever, to be performed with faithfulness and uprightness. He sent redemption to his people. He has commanded his covenant forever. Holy and awesome is his name. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All those who practice it have a good understanding. His praise endures forever.
What was the verse that kind of struck fire for you? What's the one you remember most? We invite you to log that in at this time, because we'll be asking Morris for those results momentarily. Simply hit that Numa button on the online chat. For those of you in the coffee house, if you'll hold up your numbers here, we're going to take a read of the coffee house crowd. I'm seeing a number of 7s and 2s. I'm seeing other ones too, but that seems to be yeah, I'd say we're about even on 7s and 2s. Morris, what verse has come out on the poll?
I am waiting on my next refresh. Give me just a minute.
Let me just read while you're waiting verse 7 and verse 2. Verse 2 is, great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them. And verse 7, the works of his hands are faithful and just. All his precepts are trustworthy.
I'm sorry, I'm still waiting on my next refresh.
All right. Maybe we shouldn't have jumped to you quite this fast. But after we get our verse, the band is going to play their musical feature. And what we invite you to do is take that verse that's been identified either by the world community or the one that you yourself chose, if it wasn't that one, and simply let it rest within you and ask, is there a question that you've been wrestling with this week that maybe this verse that's just stuck out for you may address in some way? Whether it be verse 7, verse 2, verse 10, what have you. Does it speak to you in any particular way? No? All right. Well, we'll just let's go to our musical feature and just simply hold that verse that we ourselves have chosen.
I'd like to introduce the fellows in the band really quickly. On the guitar, Mr. Ron Cooley. On the drums, Carlos Figueroa. Steve Gomez on the bass. And today is our Ron Cooley Music Day. He's written both of the pieces that we're going to play. A little later, we'll do God Give Them Strength for the communion. But for the feature, this is called Samba These Days.
Thanks, guys. Brew's Brothers with Ron Cooley from Mannheim Steamroller. That was a piece written by him. Great job, guys. Well, come back to Dr. Gingerich, but before we do, we want to check in with Morris to see if we were able to get a read off of our internet poll for the Pneuma verse.
We were indeed. It is verse 10 with
verse
31%.
10. Okay, so verse 10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All those who practice it have a good understanding. His praise endures forever. So we really had kind of a spread of verses that really kind of touched people this evening, and there were others besides. But the point is not to find out who the winner is, but rather simply to ask what has caught energy, and particularly important is what's caught energy for you. Let that verse kind of travel within you this week and see where it leads you. But Dr. Gingerich, I know that you've had some experience with Psalm 111 yourself.
Yes, it has so many great verses there that it's hard to choose one, but I would, of course, go for number 2, which is, great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them. And the reason is that verse is, in its Latin form, carved into the gate of the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, England. That's the wonderful laboratory where Rutherford did some of his work, a lot of great physics, but also eventually it was where Watson and Crick worked to decipher the structure of DNA, that spiral staircase. So they ran out of room in the old Cavendish Laboratory, and they built a new one out on Mattingly Road near the observatories. And one of the postdocs or graduate students, I guess, said, how about putting that verse on the gate of the new building? And the head of the department at that time said he put the proposal to the policy committee, confident they would veto it. And to my surprise, they heartily agreed, both to the idea and to the choice of Coverdale's translation. Now, the Coverdale translation was the basis for much of the King James Version. I like the King James Version, but the Coverdale's version reads, "The works of the Lord are great, sought out by all of them that have pleasure therein." And I think it's just wonderful that is now in wonderful calligraphy over the doors of the new Cavendish Laboratory.
Oh, that's great. Well, in recognition of such works, I'm actually wearing my human genome sequencing socks here, and my only pair of designer jeans. So, sorry. That's interesting that in that verse too, in Psalm 111 it says in the New Revised Standard Version, great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in Him. It seems like there's such a propensity, at least in popular Christianity, to just simply think, hey, we don't need to study anything. We'll just kind of download it all, and it's not true unless it just kind of streams in. But the actual reverencing of study, the acknowledgement that it is good and appropriate to actually study God's works, I think is refreshing. I think we're getting a little bit of a delay between my talking and your hearing me talk this time.
No, that's okay. I just am watching on my screen here in my office in the observatories in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I don't see myself in the picture. So I wasn't sure if you were looking at me.
Gotcha.
However,
so we mentioned when we took a pause earlier that you were kind of starting to talk about the heavens and the evolution of the universe a bit, and I'm struck by that. Something you write in your book really touches on actually that verse 7 that arose out in the coffee house too. The works of His hands are faithful and just. His precepts are trustworthy. You point out in your book that there is a set of constants, numerical values in the universe related to such things as gravitational pull and so forth, that seem to be so finely calibrated to suggest that they've actually been tuned by a super intelligence or a super calculating intelligence. What can you tell us about those universal constants?
Well, that's what we call fine-tuning, and I guess I can most easily do it by giving you an example, but that's just one example of many that can be chosen, which if they were just slightly different, then we wouldn't be here. Fred Hoyle, who was a kind of maverick astronomer with wonderful ideas and some crazy ones as well, was looking at the fact that we are here. We are here because of carbon chemistry. It's only the carbon atom that can bond with itself so extensively to create the many kind of organic compounds that make up our bodies. In the Big Bang, only the hydrogen and helium, a little bit of lithium came out because there just wasn't time in those first few minutes of the universe, and it rapidly expanded, and the collisions were not so effective anymore. So where did the oxygen and carbon and nitrogen come from? They were cooked up in the interiors of giant stars, and it took hundreds of millions of years, because it's a very slow process, to get enough of this. These stars then in due time exploded, and these materials were thrown out into space where they could be recycled. And you and I are recycled material. The carbon in our muscles, our fingers, our head, our brains, they were all reused star stuff from the interiors of stars. Now, Fred Hoyle was looking at the process by which the collisions could bring about from the hydrogen and helium, the carbon and so on, and he realized that just normally that was not going to work. It was going to take much longer than the time in the universe to get enough of it. It was possible would be if there was something called a resonance level in the carbon and oxygen atoms. And so he was working at Caltech at the time and went to Willie Fowler, one of the nuclear physicists who was running the atom machines and could check on things like this. And Fowler thought, this crazy Englishman, he thinks he can predict where there's going to be a resonance level. But he nevertheless went out and tried it, and lo and behold, there it was. And if it had been just a couple of percent different, the process would not have worked to make all of that carbon. And if the level in oxygen had been a little bit different, it would all the carbon would have been driven to oxygen, and there still wouldn't be any. And so this is what Fred Hoyle said when he was looking at it. Would you not say to yourself, some super calculating intellect must have designed the properties of the carbon atom. Otherwise, the chance of my finding such an atom through blind forces of nature would be utterly minuscule. Of course you would. A common sense interpretation of the fact suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature.
That's fascinating. So what I hear you say, if I could characterize the difference between your understanding of there being an intelligent designer versus the intelligent design folks, is that the intelligent design folks are essentially denying evolution by sticking God in as some supernatural force that comes in and creates stuff that couldn't be created any other way. But what you're saying is you're accepting evolution and seeing that God is a part of the whole process organically straight through.
That's right. I am saying, just like your trousers, there could be such thing as designer jeans. Anyway,
yeah.
the changes that take place in the DNA come about in various ways. One of them, are you with me?
Yeah.
Okay, my screen's gone blank, but never mind. When you have mutations, which is one way that the structure can be changed, it seems like a very random process, but it's concealed by the uncertainty principle. It's very difficult to know if there is some design behind it, but that's certainly a possibility.
Yeah, I was fascinated on that in that regard that you in your book you talk about uranium. I think it's maybe uranium-234 that has a half-life of 4.5 billion years, meaning that half of that uranium will decay into another substance in 4.5 billion years. And you were mentioning that the decay, the radioactive decay, is completely random. You can't look at a single atom of uranium and say, okay, now it's going to lose its electron and become a different substance at this point. You can't predict whether it's going to happen in 2 minutes, 2 million years, 2 billion years, and yet it has an absolutely constant rate of decay that's completely predictable.
When you get enough atoms, it's the same if you're flipping coins, quarters, let's say. You expect to get as many heads as tails, and if you're just doing a few of them, it is rather random, and you can't tell for sure. But if you're doing thousands, the chances of getting within a fraction of a percent, 50% heads and 50% tails, will work out that way. But let's look at uranium. If the half-life, as it's called, would be just half as long, the uranium would have decayed much more rapidly, and that would have changed the whole internal structure of the Earth, the way in which you have the nuclear heating that causes continental drift, and therefore the structures we have. Similarly, if it were twice as long, it wouldn't work out this way. Very odd, but that's a strange coincidence, but it's one of those details of physics that creates the universe we see around us in its particular way.
It's fascinating. You know, I want to go back to that one piece about the eye too, and our Darkwood Brew planning team was really caught up by that earlier this week, and we came up with an analogy and wanted to run it by you, see if this is at all accurate. I hope it is, because I spoke about it in worship this morning. But the way that ancient gene acts as a trigger mechanism that creates a human eye. That trigger mechanism actually is simply something that's very simple, but it turns. It's like a switch. You argue that causes a cascading group of reactions to happen, which then can create something very complex in a very short period of time. We were talking about this, and somebody said, it's kind of like a standing ovation. Like if you go to like these days, especially if you go to a performance that might not even be spectacular, which would normally warrant a standing ovation, maybe it's a bad kids performance, and like if it's just based on the performance, the odds would be like none that it would get a standing ovation. But then there's that proud parent in the front who stands up and their kid can do no wrong, and they're clapping, and so everybody's like, oh, I got to stand too, and so they start standing, and then there's some holdouts kind of towards the back saying, I'm not going to stand, but then everybody starts standing, then, oh, okay, I'll stand too, and then there's some that are clearly in the back, they're like, no way, this just cheapens standing ovations, and I'm not going to do it. But that one that stood up, they were comparing to that gene that turns on the series of reaction, that if you just base it on the odds, nothing would happen. But because that one stood up, it causes this whole cascading series of reactions to occur.
People scratched their heads when the human genome was done. This was about a decade ago now. That there seem to be so few genes, and even little nematodes had almost as many genes as a complicated human being. And this seemed very odd, but that was only 2% of the DNA. And what's happening in between? Just in the past few months, the word has come out that that intermediate DNA is filled with switches. And that can make the relatively few genes, do I remember the number correctly, about 30,000, into many more combinations. And just by triggering a switch, as you said, the proud parent standing up with the applause, can create a cascade that can change things enormously and perhaps even very quickly. So we're beginning to see ways in which new species can come out of the mix.
That's amazing. Well, I think we have time for just one question. Morris, do you have a question from the internet tonight?
I have lots of questions.
Yeah, I thought you would.
And I'm hoping not to make any in the online community angry with me. But from David in the online community, here's the question. If evolution is part of an intelligently designed universe, does it, along with the universe, possess a telos, a direction, or a completion? And then a tail on, how close can we move into determinism? Question again.
Question.
If evolution is part of an intelligently designed universe, does it, along with the universe, possess a telos, a direction, or a completion?
That's a difficult philosophical question, and I would have to say that it's very difficult to suppose that everything is fully predetermined. We have freedom of will as part of an essential part of being a human being. But one could imagine that God had a sense of direction in mind. Does God have a mind? Well, that's the only way we have of thinking about God. We have to think about God in some sort of human terms, even though God as an entity is much vaster and enormous, but there has to be facets of God's existence that can potentially interact with us. And maybe the intention was to get conscious creatures that could interact without knowing exactly how they were going to look, how many fingers they had, how many arms, how many eyes, all of that kind of thing could have been variable. On the other hand, we're seeing, and I would quote the work of Simon Conway Morris, an evolutionist in Cambridge, England, who has been working very much on what's called convergent evolution, to see that in quite diverse strands, the same kind of solution is found in body design and so on. And maybe there's a certain inevitability about the way the whole thing is set up, so that human beings, somewhat like us, were inevitable in the whole process.
Right.
These are open questions, and they're exciting questions.
They certainly are. In fact, I'd mentioned that Darkwood Brew really is kind of tracing what we would call convergence Christianity. We're in the midst of, this is the sixth series of 12 six-part series that really are looking at convergence from the faith perspective, and noticing that across a very wide variety of Christians right now, there seem to be similar hopes and yearnings and conclusions being drawn that we're kind of tracing in this series, including that faith and science can be allies in the pursuit of truth, not simply combatants. That's one of those convergent ideas that seem to be crossing a whole spectrum of Christians right now, a new openness and awakening to the possibilities of scientific inquiry. So, well,
for a huge length of time, the evolutionary process was building information and building it into the DNA. We've now reached a point where we have more information content in our brains than in our DNA in each of our cells. And that means we are now in a position to begin to change our own genome. So the future of evolution may be entirely different from what it was over the hundreds of billions of years.
Wow.
Not hundreds of billions of years, hundreds of millions of years and billions of years.
Yeah.
Those numbers are so big, it's easy to mix them up.
Well, that's a very enticing and scary thought. The future may be more in our hands than there ever has been before. Hopefully, not just in our hands, but in this intelligent creator's hands as well. Well, we thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us tonight, Dr. Gingerich, and highly recommend your book out there, God's Universe. You know, this book was actually the product of a series of lectures at Harvard University. My understanding is that Harvard, for this very prestigious lecture series that you were a part of, they almost never invite a faculty member to give the lectures, but in your case, they made an exception. It's pretty nice.
I think that was the case.
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful to Harvard University Press because they do keep the book in print as long as people are interested in it.
Yeah.
And so unlike many popular books in which after a few years the demand goes down to zero, there's a plateau on this book. We still sell a few hundred copies per year.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, after having reading it twice, I can see why the demand keeps coming in. So, well, thank you again for joining us tonight and helping us reflect on this very fascinating topic of evidence for God, or that points towards God, or intelligent designer in creation.
Thanks very much for inviting me, and it meant that I finally discovered what Skype is all about.
That's right. That's right. Congratulations to your grandson for helping you get on. Thanks. One of the things that I find fascinating about Dr. Gingerich's take on the whole idea of an intelligent designer is that he really honors both the randomness that truly exists in creation, as well as the coherence and the meaning behind it. That he's not denying either one of these, and to me that really fits with life experience. I mean, don't you find in your own life a sense that there's just a lot of randomality. There's stuff that just seems to happen for no apparent reason, and you really doubt that there could be a reason. And yet, we also instinctively feel that life is fraught with significance, with meaning, with value, that even beyond which we can ascribe ourselves. Those two things come together, and sometimes we feel that in tough ways, like, for instance, when bad things happen, like when we get blindsided by something truly tragic, perhaps, that happens to us. Somebody comes up and they want to comfort us. They say, oh, it's all part of God's plan, or, oh, all things happen for a reason. I mean, don't you just want to punch these people? I mean, it's like, no. Sometimes stuff happens, and there's no reason to it, and neither we nor apparently God seems to exercise much direct control over those things happening. And yet, if God has intelligently designed this world and this universe in a way that Owen Gingerich points to, for instance, by analogy through those genes that skew the dice a bit, that actually turn on a whole chain series of reactions, like that proud parent standing up, giving a standing ovation to a terrible performance. It would suggest that even in those times when life hits us hard for no reason whatsoever, but it's random chance, that even then, God's purpose is trying to be worked out in our life, not through causing that event, but in the reaction to it. God acts like that cheering parent, that stands up, and then we're invited, to look around, to look at our situation with new eyes. And we're invited, it's not just deterministic, we're actually invited to either stand ourselves, rise to the occasion to meet that particular crisis, or to sit with arms folding saying, no, we're not, no, this was a bad thing, I'm not going to do anything. There seems to be randomality and significance at the same time. This meal that we celebrate at Darkwood Brew every week, we participate in the gift and sacrament of communion, is suggestive about this theme as well, because it does remember a tragedy, and yet it reminds us that even amidst these tragedies, God's will for our lives and for the world ends up getting worked out through those who respond to it. And tonight, as we've been reflecting on ancient genes that then actually create things that have only become relevant in the last 200,000 years in our time, I wonder if we could look at communion this evening as something that happened 2,000 years ago, a significant event, a last meal and a death and a resurrection, and ask ourselves, what set of reactions is that switching on for us tonight as we partake of this meal? This ancient event, what is its present significance in our life? That a body could be broken, that blood could be shed, and that the shedding of the blood and the brokenness of the body did not become an end, but became instead a new beginning that would trigger reactions that are affecting our world and increasing our connection with God even in this very moment. If you happen to have bread and wine at home, or juice and crackers, or any form of food really you'd like to join us in this communion meal, we invite you now to take the bread of life and the cup of blessing and join us. Well, we thank you for joining us this evening. It's been certainly a thought-provoking evening together, and we invite you to join us next week for Dr. Gail Wallachek from Northwestern University, who was also the Associate Director of the Zygon Center for Faith and Science in Chicago. We also invite you to join us out on the blogs this week. Tomorrow I'll be posting an extended reflection on Owen Gingerich's works and some of the implications of that. And throughout the week we'll be joined by folks such as Ian Lynch, Cynthia Astle, Marianne Folkert, and Leslie Muro. They're all blogging for us this week, reflecting on this particular episode's topic. So get on the blogs, get on Facebook, and keep the conversation rolling. Until then, next week we invite you to simply share this blessing. My friends, may the Spirit of the living God, made known to us most fully in Jesus Christ our Lord, go before you to show you the way, go above you to watch over you, go behind you to push you into places you may not necessarily go yourself, go beneath you to uphold you and uplift you, go beside you to be your strong companion, and dwell within you to remind you that you are surely not alone. You are part of something much bigger than you can even imagine, far beyond what we can see, feel, taste, or touch, and yet which tugs at us through love, a love that assures us that we are loved beyond our wildest imagination. And may the fire of God's blessing burn brightly upon you and within you, now and always. Amen.
Thank you.